The dust cloud on the horizon shimmered like a mirage as Nathaniel Zimmerman collapsed at the edge of Vaughn Porter's property, her swollen belly protruding beneath her tattered dress, her face streaked with dirt and tears as the merciless summer sun beat down upon her weary form. Vaughn had been mending his fence when he spotted her fall, and he dropped his tools without hesitation, racing toward the crumpled figure with his heart pounding in his chest. Montana Territory, 1876. Summer had come early that year, scorching the earth and drying up streams that usually flowed until July. Vaughn's ranch outside of Clearwater Springs had weathered the season better than most, thanks to the natural spring that bubbled up from the limestone beneath his property. It had been a blessing when he purchased the land 3 years ago, and today it would be a blessing for someone else. "Madam, can you hear me?" Vaughn knelt beside the woman, gently turning her onto her back. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Her skin burned with fever, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. The swell of her abdomen told him she was at least 7 months along. Alone, pregnant, and miles from town, the woman's situation couldn't be more dire. Without further deliberation, Vaughn scooped her up as carefully as he could. She was lighter than she should have been, considering her condition, and that worried him all the more. His ranch house stood a quarter-mile away, and he made the journey as swiftly as he dared, his boots kicking up dust as he carried his unexpected guest to safety. The modest 2-room cabin that Vaughn called home was sparse but clean. He laid the woman on his bed, rushing to fetch water from the kitchen pump. She stirred as he pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper, her eyes still closed. "You're safe, madam." "My name's Vaughn Porter. You collapsed on my property." He spoke softly, dipping the cloth again. "Can you tell me your name?" Her cracked lips parted. "Nathaniel, Nate," she managed before a coughing fit overtook her. Vaughn helped her take small sips of water. "Easy now, you need to rest. You and your baby both." At the mention of her child, Nathaniel's eyes flew open, revealing irises the color of summer wheat. "My baby." Her hands moved protectively to her stomach. "Seems fine far as I can tell, but you're burning up with fever and looking half-starved." "When's the last time you ate?" She shook her head weakly. "I don't remember. 2 days, maybe." Vaughn's jaw tightened. No pregnant woman should be wandering the territory alone, much less without food or proper shelter. "I'll make you some broth. You need to build your strength." As he moved to stand, her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "Please, don't turn me in. I can't go back." The fear in her eyes gave Vaughn pause. He'd seen that look before, in horses that had been mistreated, in men who'd come back broken from the war. "I'm not turning you in anywhere, Miss Nathaniel. Not until you're well enough to tell me your story, and even then, only if it's the right thing to do." Relief washed over her features and her grip loosened. "Thank you." Vaughn moved to his small kitchen area and set about preparing a simple broth from the venison he'd smoked the previous week. As it simmered, he glanced back at the bed where Nathaniel had already drifted into an uneasy sleep. He'd have to ride into town for supplies tomorrow and perhaps for the doctor, though Doc Wallace was known to ask too many questions. The next few hours passed quietly as Vaughn tended to his unexpected guest. He coaxed spoonfuls of broth past her lips when she woke briefly, helped her sip water, and kept the fever cloth cool against her brow. As night fell, he made himself a pallet on the floor beside the fireplace, leaving her the comfort of his bed. Morning brought with it a slight improvement in Nathaniel's condition. Her fever had broken sometime during the night, though exhaustion still lined her face. Vaughn was stirring a pot of oatmeal when he heard her stir. "Mr. Porter," he turned to find her attempting to sit up. "Whoa there. Take it easy." Vaughn crossed the room in 3 strides, helping her arrange the pillows behind her back. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Better, weak but better." Her eyes darted around the cabin. "I'm sorry to impose on you like this." Vaughn shook his head. "No imposition. Couldn't very well leave you out there to die, could I?" He poured a cup of water and handed it to her. "Think you can manage some oatmeal? You need to keep your strength up." Nathaniel nodded, accepting the cup with trembling hands. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me. Let's not dwell on that." Vaughn returned to the stove, spooning oatmeal into a bowl. "I need to ride into town for supplies today. Will you be all right here alone for a few hours?" A flicker of panic crossed her features. "Town." Will you tell anyone about me? Vaughn studied her carefully. She was hiding from something or someone, that much was clear. No, madam, your presence here is your business to share or keep. He brought the bowl to her bedside. But I do need to know if there's trouble following you. For both our sakes. Nathaniel stared down at the steaming oatmeal, conflict evident in her expression. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. My husband died 3 months ago, influenza. Her hand moved to her stomach. His brother decided I belonged to him afterward. Said it was his right to claim his brother's widow and unborn child. Anger flashed through Vaughn's chest. And you disagreed. He was cruel, Mr. Porter, cruel in ways I can't speak of. Her fingers gripped the bowl tightly. I fled in the night 2 weeks ago. I've been traveling ever since, heading west. I had some money, but it was stolen at a way station 4 days ago, along with most of my provisions. Vaughn sat on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. You're safe here, Miss Nathaniel. No one's going to force you to go anywhere you don't want to. Gratitude shone in her eyes, mingling with unshed tears. Please call me Nate, everyone does. Did Nate it is then. Vaughn stood, retrieving his hat from its peg. Try to eat as much as you can, I'll be back before sundown. The ride into Clearwater Springs took just over an hour. The town was small but growing, with a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a handful of other businesses lining the single dusty street. Vaughn tied his horse outside Hargrove's general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. Vaughn Porter, haven't seen you in near 2 weeks. Gerald Hargrove, the proprietor, greeted him from behind the counter. Been busy with the herd, Vaughn replied, picking up a basket. He began selecting items: flour, coffee, sugar, and then, after a moment's consideration, added dried apples, a tin of hard candies, and a bolt of soft cotton fabric. Gerald raised an eyebrow at the unusual additions. Expecting company, Porter? Vaughn kept his expression neutral. Just stocking up, been running low on essentials. He added a few more items to his basket, including some medical supplies, if you say so. Gerald began tallying the purchases. Heard from Sheriff Mills that the Blackfoot have been spotted further south than usual. Might want to keep your eyes open. Vaughn nodded. The relationship between settlers and the native tribes had been relatively peaceful in this part of Montana recently, but tensions could flare without warning. Appreciate the heads up. After paying for his supplies, Vaughn made one more stop at the small apothecary at the end of the street. Mrs. Abernathy, the owner, was known for her knowledge of herbal remedies and her discretion. Mr. Porter, what can I help you with today? The gray-haired woman adjusted her spectacles as he entered. Need something for fever, exhaustion, and, he lowered his voice, something suitable for a woman in the family way. Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose slightly, but she asked no questions as she gathered various packets and bottles. Steep the willow bark for fever. This tincture will help with strength, and these herbs will support the mother and child. She wrapped everything carefully. Anything else? Vaughn hesitated. If there were complications with the pregnancy, what signs should one watch for? The older woman studied him intently. Severe pain, bleeding, dizziness that doesn't pass, high fever that returns. She leaned closer. If such things occur, Mr. Porter, a doctor would be advisable regardless of circumstances. Vaughn nodded, understanding her meaning. Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy. The sun was beginning its descent when Vaughn returned to his ranch. As he approached the cabin, a momentary fear gripped him. What if Nate had fled? Or worse, what if her condition had deteriorated while he was gone? He quickened his pace, relief flooding through him when he opened the door to find her sitting up in bed, his mother's old quilt drawn over her legs. You're still here, he said, setting his packages on the table. Nate offered a tired smile. Did you think I would leave? I'm not sure I could make it to your front porch without help. Vaughn removed his hat, hanging it on its customary peg. How are you feeling? A bit stronger. I managed to walk to the washstand and back. She gestured to her face, which was notably cleaner than before. I hope you don't mind. Not at all. He began unpacking his purchases. I brought some things that might make you more comfortable and some medicines from Mrs. Abernathy. Nate watched him curiously. You went to a lot of trouble for a stranger. Vaughn paused, considering her words. My ma taught me that a person in need is never a stranger, just a friend you haven't properly met yet. He pulled out the bolt of fabric. Thought you might want a fresh dress. I'm no seamstress, but Mrs. Henderson down the valley might help. Nate's eyes widened. You didn't tell anyone about me, did you? No, Vaughn assured her quickly. But if you're staying a while, you'll need proper clothes. Your current ones are. He trailed off, not wanting to offend. In tatters, she finished for him, a hint of amusement in her voice. You're right, of course. And thank you for the fabric and for keeping my secret. Vaughn nodded, slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude. He wasn't used to having company, especially female company, in his home. 3 years of bachelor living had left him unaccustomed to the niceties of social interaction. I should see to the livestock, he said, retrieving his hat. Will you be all right for a bit longer? I've imposed enough, Nate began, attempting to swing her legs over the side of the bed. Maybe I should try to help. You'll do no such thing, Vaughn interrupted firmly. Your job right now is to rest and regain your strength, for your sake and the baby's. Something in his tone must have conveyed his seriousness because Nate relented, settling back against the pillows. At least let me prepare dinner when you return. I can manage that much. Vaughn considered arguing further but recognized the pride in her request. We'll see how you're feeling later. For now, just rest. The following days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Vaughn would rise at dawn, tend to the most pressing ranch chores, and return to check on Nate before heading out again. She grew stronger each day, eventually insisting on taking over the cooking and some light housework, despite Vaughn's protests. By the end of the first week, she was able to move around the cabin freely, though she tired easily and required frequent rest. They spoke little of her past beyond what she had already shared. Vaughn learned she had been married for just over a year before her husband's death, that she had grown up in Ohio, and that she had no family left to return to. In turn, he told her about his journey west after the war, how he'd worked cattle drives for years before saving enough to buy his modest spread, and about his hopes to expand his herd in the coming years. On the 10th day of her stay, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Nate broached the subject they had both been avoiding. I can't stay here indefinitely, Mr. Porter. Vaughn, he corrected automatically. After days of insisting, he'd finally convinced her to use his given name, though she often forgot in moments of seriousness. Vaughn, she amended. I'm grateful for everything you've done, but I need to make plans. My baby will come in less than 2 months, and I need to establish myself somewhere. Vaughn kept his gaze on the horizon. You have somewhere in mind. I was heading to Oregon. I have a distant cousin in Portland who might take me in. Might. Vaughn turned to look at her then, noting the uncertainty in her expression. Nate sighed. We haven't spoken in years, but she's my only hope for family connection. Vaughn was silent for a long moment. Winter comes early in the mountains. The passes could be snowed in by October. I know. Nate rubbed her swollen belly absently. That's why I need to leave soon, before I'm too far along to travel and before the weather turns. The thought of her traveling alone again, especially as her time grew nearer, sat poorly with Vaughn, but what alternative could he offer? A single man and a pregnant widow living together would scandalize the community if word got out. Yet the idea of sending her away twisted something in his chest. Give it another week, he found himself saying. Build your strength more, then we'll discuss options. Relief softened Nate's features. Thank you. A week sounds reasonable. That night, as Vaughn lay on his pallet by the fire, he had insisted Nate continue using his bed. He stared at the ceiling, troubled by thoughts of her departure. In just 10 days, her presence had transformed his solitary cabin into something warmer, more inviting. The smell of fresh bread often greeted him when he returned from his chores. Conversation over meals had become something he looked forward to rather than the silent affairs he was accustomed to. And then there was Nate herself. Her quiet strength impressed him daily. Despite everything she'd endured, she maintained a gentle dignity that Vaughn found increasingly admirable. The way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, how she hummed softly while kneading dough, the serious expression she wore when reading one of his few books, these small details had somehow become important to him. With a sigh, Vaughn rolled onto his side. He was getting ahead of himself. Nate needed safety and security, not the complicated feelings of a rough cattle rancher. Whatever happened next, her well-being and that of her unborn child had to come first. The promised week passed more quickly than either of them anticipated. Nate continued to recover her strength, though her advancing pregnancy brought new discomforts. Vaughn found reasons to delay their conversation about her departure, a fence that needed mending, a calf that required attention, a thunderstorm that made travel discussions seem premature. It was Nate who finally forced the issue one evening as they sat at the small kitchen table, the remains of supper between them. "Vaughn, we can't keep avoiding this. I need to make arrangements." Her tone was gentle but firm. Vaughn nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. "I've been thinking about your situation." He met her gaze directly. "The journey to Oregon would be difficult even for someone not in your condition. The mountain passes, the possibility of early snow, the risk of encountering trouble along the way." He shook his head. "I can't in good conscience encourage you to attempt it." "What choice do I have?" Frustration edged her voice. "I can't impose on your hospitality forever. And once the baby comes, stay," Vaughn interrupted, the word escaping before he could consider its implications. "Stay here at least until after the baby is born," Nate's eyes widened. "Here, but what would people say? A single woman living with an unmarried man, we'd be discreet. Few people come this way, especially as winter approaches." Vaughn leaned forward. "You'd have shelter, food, protection. The baby would arrive somewhere safe. And come spring, if you still want to go to Oregon, I'd help you make the journey properly, with supplies, a good horse." "That's incredibly generous." Nate looked down at her hands. "But I have nothing to offer in return." "You've already changed this place for the better," Vaughn said quietly. "It's been a long time since this cabin felt like a home." A soft blush colored Nate's cheeks. "Even so, I can't accept such generosity without contributing somehow." Vaughn considered this. "You already cook and keep things tidy, which is more than I managed on my own. If you're determined to contribute more, maybe you could help with the accounts. I've never had a head for numbers." The tension in Nate's shoulders eased slightly. "I was a school teacher before I married." "Numbers I can manage. Then it's settled." Vaughn felt a weight lift from his chest. "You'll stay until spring and we'll reassess then." Nate studied him for a long moment, as though trying to read something in his expression. "Why are you doing all this, Vaughn? You owe me nothing." The question caught him off guard. Why indeed? He'd asked himself the same thing countless times over the past weeks. "I suppose." He began slowly. "I know what it's like to be alone in the world with nowhere to turn. After the war, before I came west, I was adrift. If not for the kindness of a few good people, I might not have survived." He met her gaze. "Sometimes all a person needs is a chance to catch their breath before continuing their journey." Something shifted in Nate's expression, a softening, a recognition. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving me that chance." As summer turned to autumn, Nate's presence at the Porter Ranch became a fixed reality rather than a temporary arrangement. Vaughn expanded his daily routine to include regular trips to check the perimeter of his property, wary of potential threats from Nate's past or curious neighbors. He rode into town less frequently, sending occasional letters to Mrs. Henderson about the fabric he'd purchased, claiming it was for curtains he never intended to make. Nate's pregnancy progressed, her belly growing rounder as the weeks passed. She maintained her duties around the cabin as best she could, though Vaughn insisted she rest whenever fatigue overtook her. In the evenings, they often sat by the fire, Nate mending clothes or reading aloud from one of Vaughn's books while he whittled or cleaned his tools. It was during one such evening, with October's chill settling over the land, that Nate gasped suddenly, her hand flying to her stomach. Vaughn was on his feet instantly. "What is it? Is it time?" Nate shook her head, a smile spreading across her face. No, the baby's kicking, strongly." She hesitated, then extended her hand toward him. "Would you like to feel?" Vaughn froze, caught between curiosity and propriety. After a moment's hesitation, he set aside his whittling and moved to kneel beside her chair. With trembling fingers, he allowed her to guide his hand to the swell of her abdomen. For several seconds, he felt nothing. Then, a distinct movement against his palm, a push, a life announcing its presence. Vaughn's breath caught in his throat. "That's..." Words failed him. "Incredible, isn't it?" Nate's voice was soft, intimate in the firelit cabin. Vaughn nodded, unable to articulate the emotion swelling in his chest. The trust she showed in sharing this moment with him, the miracle of new life beneath his hand, it overwhelmed him in ways he hadn't expected. "Thank you," he managed finally, slowly withdrawing his hand. "For sharing that." Nate's eyes met his, warm and full of something he dared not name. "You've shared your home, your protection. This seems a small thing in comparison." But it wasn't small, they both knew it. Something had shifted between them, a boundary crossed. As Vaughn returned to his chair, he found himself unable to concentrate on his whittling. His mind filled instead with thoughts of Nate and her child and his growing place in their story. The weeks that followed brought increasingly cold weather to the Montana territory. Vaughn spent long hours cutting and stacking firewood, repairing the roof and walls of the cabin to eliminate drafts, and ensuring the root cellar was well stocked for the coming winter. Nate, now in her 8th month, moved more slowly but remained determined to contribute, preserving the last of the garden's produce and preparing the cabin for the baby's arrival. One morning in early November, Vaughn woke to find snow falling heavily outside the cabin windows. He stoked the fire quickly, concern growing as he assessed the rapidly accumulating white blanket covering his property. This was more than an early dusting, this was the beginning of winter in earnest. "It's beautiful," Nate said from the doorway of the bedroom, one hand supporting her back as she watched the snowfall. Vaughn nodded, though his mind was on more practical matters. "Beautiful and troublesome. I need to check on the livestock, make sure they're sheltered." He pulled on his heavy coat and gloves. "Stay inside where it's warm, I'll be back as quick as I can." The bitter cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped outside. The snow had already accumulated to mid-calf, and visibility was poor beyond 20 yards. Vaughn trudged to the barn, relieved to find the cattle and horses had instinctively sought shelter inside. He worked quickly, ensuring all animals were accounted for and had access to feed and unfrozen water. As he secured the barn doors against the storm, movement at the edge of his property caught his eye. Vaughn squinted through the swirling snow, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. 3 riders approached slowly, their figures indistinct in the whiteness. Strangers rarely meant good news, especially in weather like this. Vaughn positioned himself between the approaching riders and the path to his cabin, his mind racing. Could they be connected to Nate's brother-in-law, random travelers seeking shelter, or something worse? As the riders drew closer, Vaughn recognized the lead figure, Sheriff Mills from Clearwater Springs, accompanied by 2 men he didn't know. Relief mingled with apprehension. The sheriff's presence suggested official business rather than nefarious intent, but it could still spell trouble for Nate. "Porter," Sheriff Mills called over the wind as they approached. "Glad we found you before this storm got any worse." "Sheriff," Vaughn acknowledged, keeping his expression neutral. "What brings you out in this weather?" Mills dismounted, gesturing for his companions to remain on horseback. "Looking for someone. Woman, early 20s, pregnant." He studied Vaughn's face carefully. "Name of Nathaniel Zimmerman. Her brother-in-law's been searching for her for months. Says she ran off after her husband died, possibly unstable with grief." Vaughn's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Haven't seen anyone fitting that description, been pretty isolated out here." The sheriff glanced toward the cabin. "Mind if we warm up inside before heading back? Been riding since dawn." It wasn't really a request. Vaughn hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course." "Tie your horses in the barn where they'll be protected." As the men secured their mounts, Vaughn's mind raced. If Nate was visible when they entered the cabin, everything would unravel. He needed to warn her, but there was no way to do so without arousing suspicion. The group trudged through the deepening snow toward the cabin. Just before Vaughn opened the door, he stomped his boots loudly, coughing and making as much noise as possible while brushing snow from his clothes. It was a weak warning, but the only one he could manage. "Come on in," he said, pushing the door open with forced casualness. The cabin's main room was empty. The bedroom door was closed. Vaughn sent a silent prayer of thanks for Nate's quick thinking. "Coffee," he offered, moving to the stove to hide his relief. "Appreciate it," Sheriff Mills said, removing his gloves and hat. "This is Marshal Davies and his deputy Blake. They've come from Helena on official business." The marshal, a stern-faced man with a thick mustache, nodded curtly. "Mr. Porter. The sheriff speaks highly of you as a law-abiding citizen." "I try to stay on the right side of things," Vaughn replied, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. "What's this about a missing woman?" Marshal Davies pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. Nathaniel Zimmerman fled her home in Illinois following her husband's death. Her brother-in-law, Edmund Zimmerman, is her legal guardian according to Illinois state law. He's concerned for her welfare and that of her unborn child. Vaughn kept his expression carefully blank as he set cups on the table. Sounds like a family matter. It is, the marshal agreed, but it becomes a legal matter when property is involved. Mrs. Zimmerman apparently took items belonging to the family estate when she fled. Theft. They were accusing Nate of theft to justify forcing her return. Vaughn's blood boiled, but he maintained his composure. What sort of items? Family heirlooms, jewelry belonging to the Zimmerman family, and a substantial amount of cash. The marshal watched Vaughn closely. You're certain you haven't encountered this woman? Quite certain. Vaughn poured the coffee, keeping his hands steady through force of will. Not many travelers come this way, and certainly no pregnant women on their own. Sheriff Mills sipped his coffee, his gaze wandering around the cabin. Nice place you've got, Porter. Seems different somehow. More. He paused, searching for the word. Homey than I remember. Vaughn shrugged. Made some improvements. Man gets tired of living like a bachelor eventually. The marshal finished his coffee quickly, clearly eager to continue their search. We should move on if we want to make it to the Henderson place before dark. Vaughn's heart sank. Mrs. Henderson would almost certainly mention the fabric he'd purchased for curtains. Weather's turning worse, he observed, nodding toward the window where snow now fell in heavy sheets. Might be wise to head back to town instead. Mountains can be treacherous in a storm like this. Sheriff Mills frowned. He's right, Marshal. These parts can turn deadly when winter sets in early. We can resume the search when conditions improve. The marshal looked displeased but nodded reluctantly. Very well, but we will continue looking once the weather clears. This woman must be found before her condition advances too far. As the men prepared to leave, the deputy who had remained silent throughout the exchange suddenly paused near the bedroom door. What's in here? He asked, reaching for the handle. Vaughn tensed. My private quarters, nothing of interest. The deputy's hand hesitated on the latch. Sheriff Mills intervened. Come on, Blake. Porter's been cooperative enough letting us warm ourselves. No need to invade his privacy further. With obvious reluctance, the deputy withdrew his hand and followed the others to the door. Vaughn accompanied them to the barn to retrieve their horses, providing directions for the safest route back to town and reiterating the dangers of the mountain passes in winter conditions. Only after the three figures had disappeared into the swirling snow did Vaughn allow himself to breathe normally again. He secured the barn and hurried back to the cabin, his mind filled with new worries. They would return, that much was certain. And next time they might not be so easily turned away. When Vaughn entered the cabin, he found Nate emerging from the bedroom, her face pale with fear. They're looking for me, she whispered. Edmund sent them. Vaughn nodded grimly. They've gone for now. The storm bought us some time. He guided her to a chair. Sit before you fall. You're shaking. I heard everything. Nate's hands twisted in her lap. They said I stole family heirlooms. Vaughn, I took nothing but my own mother's locket and what little money my husband left me. I believe you. Vaughn knelt beside her chair. But they'll be back when the weather clears and they'll search more thoroughly. I should leave, Nate said, her voice breaking. I've brought this trouble to your doorstep. You're not going anywhere. Vaughn's tone left no room for argument. Not in your condition and certainly not in this weather. He took her trembling hands in his. We'll figure something out. Nate's eyes met his, filled with gratitude and fear. What can we do? They have the law on their side. Vaughn considered their options, none of which seemed ideal. First, we wait out the storm. It could last days, even weeks. By then, he hesitated. By then I'll have had the baby, Nate finished softly. Yes, and that might change things. Vaughn squeezed her hands gently. For now, rest. We're safe tonight at least. The storm raged for 3 days, blanketing the countryside in deep snow and effectively isolating the ranch from the outside world. Vaughn used the time to formulate plans, considering and discarding various scenarios. If Nate fled, where could she go in her condition? If she stayed, how could they prevent the authorities from taking her back to a man she feared? On the 4th day, as the storm finally abated, Vaughn made his decision. After breakfast, he sat across from Nate at the table, his expression solemn. I've been thinking about our situation, he began. And I believe there's only one solution that makes sense. Nate looked up from her tea, apprehension clear in her eyes. What's that? Vaughn took a deep breath. Marriage. The cup froze halfway to Nate's lips. What? If we were married, your brother-in-law would have no legal claim on you. As your husband, I would be your guardian under the law. Vaughn kept his tone matter of fact, though his heart hammered in his chest. It would be a practical arrangement for your protection and the baby's. Nate set down her cup carefully. Vaughn, I can't ask you to sacrifice your future for my sake. You didn't ask, I'm offering. He met her gaze steadily. Unless the idea is completely objectionable to you, it's not that. Nate's cheeks colored slightly. You've been more than kind to me, but marriage, that's a lifetime commitment. It doesn't have to be, Vaughn said, though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. Once the danger has passed, if you still wish to go to Oregon, we could seek an annulment. Or you could stay and we could continue as friends. The word felt inadequate, but he wouldn't pressure her with the depth of the feelings he'd developed. Nate was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. You would do that for me. Enter a marriage of convenience, possibly bind yourself to a woman you barely know and her child. Vaughn reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of touching hers. Nate, in these past weeks, I've come to know you better than most people I've encountered in my life. Your strength, your kindness, your determination, these are qualities any man would be fortunate to find in a wife. He paused, gathering his courage. If you agree, it needn't be merely convenient, it could, in time, become something real. The admission hung in the air between them. Nate's eyes widened slightly, and Vaughn feared he'd said too much. But then she turned her hand palm up, allowing her fingers to meet his. I think, she said softly, it already has begun to become something real. Hope bloomed in Vaughn's chest. Is that a yes, then? Nate nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. Yes, Vaughn Porter, I will marry you. The following day dawned clear and cold. Vaughn rose before first light, determined to reach town and return before the marshal and his deputy could resume their search. He dressed in his best shirt, which wasn't saying much, and packed supplies for the journey. Are you certain about this? Nate asked as she helped him prepare. Once done, it can't be undone easily. Vaughn paused in buttoning his coat. I've never been more certain of anything. He hesitated, then added, but if you have doubts, no. Nate shook her head firmly. No doubts, just amazement that fate would bring me to your doorstep of all places. Vaughn allowed himself a small smile. Providence works in mysterious ways. The journey to Clearwater Springs took longer than usual due to the snow-covered trails. Vaughn rode directly to the small church at the edge of town, relieved to find Reverend Thomas inside, tending to the stove. Mr. Porter, this is a surprise. The Reverend greeted him warmly. What brings you to town after such a storm? Vaughn removed his hat. I need your help, Reverend, a matter of some urgency and discretion. By mid-afternoon, Vaughn was riding back toward his ranch, the Reverend following on his own horse. They had stopped briefly at the general store, where Vaughn had purchased a simple gold band, the only ring Gerald Hargrove had in stock. The Reverend had agreed to perform the ceremony immediately upon hearing a simplified version of Nate's situation, his compassionate nature overriding any concerns about propriety. As they approached the ranch, Vaughn scanned the horizon nervously, half expecting to see the marshal's party. But the landscape remained empty, pristine white under the winter sun. Relief flooded through him as they reached the cabin without incident. Nate had prepared for their arrival as best she could. The cabin was tidied, a fire blazed cheerfully in the hearth, and she had changed into the new dress she'd fashioned from the fabric Vaughn had purchased weeks ago. Her hair was arranged simply but elegantly, and she had pinned her mother's locket at her throat. When Vaughn entered with the Reverend, she rose awkwardly from her chair, her advanced pregnancy making movement cumbersome. The sight of her nervous but resolute, beautiful in her simple finery stole Vaughn's breath away. Reverend Thomas, this is Nathaniel Zimmerman, Vaughn said, removing his coat. Nate, Reverend Thomas has agreed to perform the ceremony today. The Reverend smiled kindly. It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Zimmerman. Mr. Porter has explained some of your circumstances. I'm happy to help. Gratitude shone in Nate's eyes. Thank you, Reverend. You're very kind. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. Standing before the fireplace in the small cabin, Vaughn and Nate exchanged simple vows, promising to honor and protect one another for as long as they both should live. When Vaughn slipped the gold band onto Nate's finger, his hand trembled slightly. The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Vaughn placed a gentle, chaste kiss on Nate's lips there first. After sharing a meal with them, Reverend Thomas prepared to depart. "I'll file the marriage certificate at the county office tomorrow," he assured them, "and I'll be discreet about the circumstances." He clasped Vaughn's hand warmly. "God bless your union. Sometimes marriages formed of necessity become the strongest bonds of all." Once alone, a new awkwardness fell between the newlyweds. Vaughn busied himself stoking the fire while Nate cleared the dinner dishes. So, Vaughn finally broke the silence. "Mrs. Porter." Nate looked up, a smile playing at her lips. "It sounds strange, doesn't it?" "Strange, but not unpleasant." Vaughn moved to help her with the dishes. "We should discuss sleeping arrangements. I'll continue on my pallet by the fire, of course." "Of course," Nate agreed quickly, though something like disappointment flickered across her features. "Though as far as the law is concerned, we're truly married." Vaughn nodded, "In every legal sense, but I meant what I said I won't press for. That is, I don't expect." "I know," Nate saved him from his fumbling. "You're a good man, Vaughn Porter." She reached for his hand. "And I'm fortunate to have found you." Vaughn raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I'm the fortunate one." The days following their hasty wedding were filled with a strange domestic tranquility. Despite the legal change in their relationship, little altered in their daily routines. Vaughn continued to sleep by the fire, Nate in the bedroom. They shared meals, conversation, and the tasks required to keep the ranch functioning through the harsh winter weather, yet subtle shifts occurred. Their conversations grew deeper, more intimate. Casual touches, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing while passing dishes became more frequent. And sometimes, Vaughn would catch Nate watching him with an expression that made his heart race. A week after the wedding, Sheriff Mills appeared at their door, alone this time. Vaughn invited him in, Nate standing proudly at his side, her wedding ring prominently displayed. "Sheriff," Vaughn greeted him, "I'd like you to meet my wife, Nathaniel Porter." Mills's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Wife, when did this happen?" "Last week," Nate replied calmly. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony. The sheriff's gaze moved between them, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I see. Well, that complicates matters." "How so?" Vaughn kept his tone innocent. Mills sighed. "Marshal Davies won't be pleased." He was quite determined to locate a missing woman named Nathaniel Zimmerman. "My maiden name," Nate acknowledged. "But as you can see, Sheriff, I'm no longer missing. I'm exactly where I belong." The sheriff accepted the cup of coffee Nate offered him. "The marshal mentioned a brother-in-law searching for you, man named Edmund Zimmerman." Nate's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "My late husband's brother. He hoped to claim guardianship over me and my child, but as you can see, I've found a new guardian in my husband." Mills studied them both for a long moment. "Marriage changes things legally. The marshal can't force a married woman to return to her former brother-in-law." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Though this Edmund fellow might not give up so easily." "Let him come," Vaughn said, his voice hardening. "My wife is staying right here where she belongs." After the sheriff departed promising to inform the marshal of the change in circumstances, Vaughn and Nate shared a moment of relief. "Do you think that's the end of it?" Nate asked, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Vaughn wished he could reassure her completely. "Legally, yes, no one can force you to go with Edmund now, but men like him who believe they're entitled to what they want." He shook his head. "We'll remain vigilant." December arrived with bitter cold and heavy snowfalls. The ranch was now truly isolated, the trails to town often impassable. Vaughn spent his days ensuring the livestock survived the harsh conditions, repairing equipment in the barn, and keeping the cabin warm and secure. Nate's pregnancy had advanced to its final stages. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her back often aching from the weight she carried. Vaughn found himself watching her with increasing concern and tenderness. Despite her discomfort, she maintained her gentle humor and continued to manage the household as best she could. One evening, as a particularly fierce blizzard howled outside, they sat before the fire, Vaughn reading aloud from a dog-eared copy of Ivanhoe, while Nate worked on a small blanket she was knitting for the baby. Suddenly, she gasped, her knitting needles clattering to the floor. Vaughn looked up sharply. "What is it?" Nate's face had gone pale. I think it's time." For a moment, Vaughn froze, panic threatening to overwhelm him, then his practical nature asserted itself. "Are you certain it could be false labor?" Nate shook her head as another spasm crossed her features. "No, this is different. The baby is coming." Vaughn was on his feet instantly, mind racing through everything he knew about childbirth, which wasn't much. He'd helped deliver calves and foals, but this was entirely different. "What do you need me to do?" "Help me to the bed," Nate managed through gritted teeth. "And fetch water, clean linens." The next hours passed in a blur of fear and determination. Nate's labor progressed steadily, her pains growing more intense and frequent as the night wore on. Vaughn remained at her side, supporting her as she walked when she could, holding her hand through contractions, wiping her brow with cool cloths when fever seemed to overtake her. "I wish Mrs. Abernathy were here," he said as dawn approached, feeling helpless in the face of Nate's suffering. "Or any woman with experience in these matters." Nate squeezed his hand, her face contorted with another contraction. "You're doing fine," she gasped. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not with only me to help them," Vaughn muttered, but he squared his shoulders, determined to see them both through this ordeal. As the first light of morning filtered through the cabin windows, Nate's labor intensified dramatically. "It's coming," she cried, clutching Vaughn's hand with surprising strength. "The baby's coming now." What followed tested every ounce of Vaughn's courage and composure. Following Nate's breathless instructions and his own instincts, he positioned himself to receive the child, murmuring encouragement as Nate pushed with the last of her strength. And then, miraculously, a new life slipped into his waiting hands, small, slippery, and perfect. A lusty cry filled the cabin as the infant took its first breath. "A boy," Vaughn announced, his voice thick with emotion. "Nate, we have a son." Tears streamed down Nate's exhausted face as Vaughn carefully placed the newborn on her chest. "Hello, little one," she whispered, touching the baby's tiny fingers with wonder. "We've been waiting for you." Vaughn watched them, this woman who had stumbled into his life and the child who now completed their unlikely family. Something profound shifted in his chest, a protective love so fierce it nearly overwhelmed him. This child might not carry his blood, but in every way that mattered, he was now a father. "He needs a name," Nate said softly, looking up at Vaughn with tired eyes. Vaughn gently touched the baby's dark hair. "What was your husband's name?" "James," Nate replied, "but I'd rather not." Understanding crossed Vaughn's features. "What about your father?" Nate considered this. "William, my father was William." "William Porter," Vaughn tested the name. "It's a good, strong name." Nate's eyes filled with fresh tears. "You'd give him your name?" "Truly." Vaughn sat carefully on the edge of the bed, one arm going around Nate's shoulders. "He is my son now, in every way that matters." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "And you are my wife. Not just on paper, not just for convenience." He paused, gathering his courage. "I love you, Nathaniel Porter. I think I began falling in love with you that first day when you showed such courage even at your weakest moment." Nate turned her face toward his, her expression one of wonder and joy despite her exhaustion. "I love you too, Vaughn. I've been afraid to say it, afraid you'd think it was only gratitude or necessity. And now," Vaughn brushed a strand of damp hair from her forehead, "now I know better." Nate smiled down at their son. "Now we're truly a family." The weeks following William's birth were both exhausting and exhilarating. The baby proved to have a healthy set of lungs and an appetite to match, keeping his parents awake through many long nights. Vaughn moved his things into the bedroom, no longer content to sleep separated from his family. Their marriage, begun as a practical arrangement, deepened into a true bond of love and partnership. Winter maintained its grip on the Montana territory, isolating the small family from the outside world. Vaughn ventured into town only once, returning with supplies and news that Marshal Davies had departed for Helena, apparently accepting if reluctantly that his quarry was now legally beyond his reach. "And Edmund?" Nate asked anxiously, cradling William as Vaughn unpacked the supplies. "No sign of him," Vaughn assured her. Sheriff Mills thinks he likely gave up the search when he learned of our marriage. Even if he contests it, the law is on our side now. Relief washed over Nate's features. So we're truly safe. Vaughn crossed to her, placing a gentle kiss on her lips, then on William's forehead. We're safe, and come spring, we'll decide together what our future holds. Oregon, if you still wish it, or building our life here. Nate leaned into his embrace. I already know what I want. This ranch, this life we're creating together, it's more than I ever dared hope for. As winter finally released its hold on the land, new life sprouted everywhere on the Porter Ranch. Calves frolicked in greening pastures, wildflowers dotted the hillsides, and William grew stronger daily, his curious eyes taking in the world around him. One evening in early May, Vaughn and Nate sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple. William slept peacefully in Nate's arms, his tiny fingers curled around one of hers. I never thanked you properly, Nate said suddenly. Vaughn turned to her, eyebrow raised. For what? For finding me that day, for taking me in. She smiled down at their son. For giving us both a home and a future. Vaughn reached for her free hand, lacing his fingers through hers. You gave me just as much in return, a family, purpose. He squeezed her hand gently. Love. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the mountains, Vaughn Porter looked at his wife and son and marveled at how his solitary existence had transformed. From a chance encounter with a desperate woman on the brink of collapse to this moment of perfect contentment, life had taken an unexpected turn and led him exactly where he needed to be. What are you thinking? Nate asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Vaughn smiled, lifting their joined hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. I'm thinking that some journeys end exactly where they're meant to. Spring blossomed fully into summer, bringing with it long, warm days and the constant work of ranch life. Vaughn had hired 2 hands to help with the expanding herd, allowing him more time with his family. William was growing rapidly, his dark hair and curious eyes reminiscent of his mother, his determined nature already showing signs of matching his adoptive father's. On a perfect July day, almost exactly a year after Nathaniel had collapsed at the edge of Vaughn's property, they held a proper wedding celebration. The small gathering included Reverend Thomas, Sheriff Mills and his wife, Mrs. Henderson, and a few neighbors who had come to know and respect the Porter family over the passing months. Under an arch of wildflowers beside the creek that ran through their property, Vaughn and Nate exchanged new vows not born of necessity this time, but of the deep love that had grown between them. William, held by Mrs. Henderson, gurgled happily as if approving his parents' union. I never thought I'd find happiness again, Nate said later that evening as they danced slowly in their cabin, the guests departed and William asleep in his cradle. After James died after Edmund, she shuddered slightly at the memory. Vaughn drew her closer. That's all behind us now. Edmund never surfaced again after the marshal returned to Helena. You're safe here, we both are. Nate rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd collapsed on someone else's property that day? Or if you hadn't been mending that fence at that exact moment? Sometimes, Vaughn admitted. But then I remember something my mother used to say, that the Lord puts people in our path when we need them most. He kissed the top of her head. I think perhaps we both needed saving that day. In the years that followed, the Porter Ranch prospered. Vaughn's cattle operation expanded, allowing them to build a larger home with a proper nursery for William and eventually for his younger brother Robert, born 2 years after William's arrival. Nathaniel established a small school on their property, teaching not only their sons but the children of neighboring ranchers and their workers. The fear of Edmund Zimmerman faded with time, though Nate would occasionally start at the sight of a stranger riding onto their property. But as the years passed, she grew more confident in her security and happiness. On William's 5th birthday, as they watched him play with his younger brother in the summer sunshine, Vaughn wrapped an arm around his wife's waist. Any regrets? He asked softly. About staying in Montana. About our life together. Nate turned in his embrace, reaching up to trace the lines that time and weather had etched around his eyes. Not a single one, she said firmly. That day when I thought my journey was ending, when I had no strength left and collapsed on your land, it was actually just beginning. She smiled, the same smile that had first captured his heart years ago, and it's been the most beautiful journey imaginable. Vaughn lowered his head to kiss her, their love deeper and richer for all they had experienced together. From a desperate act of kindness to a marriage of convenience, and finally to this, a genuine partnership built on love, respect, and shared dreams. Mrs. Porter, he murmured against her lips, I believe our journey is just getting started. As their son's laughter filled the summer air and the Montana mountains stood witness to their happiness, both Vaughn and Nathaniel Porter knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings led to the most perfect endings, and that true love could indeed grow from the most desperate of circumstances. And in years to come, when William and Robert Porter would ask for the story of how their parents met, Vaughn and Nate would share a knowing look before telling them the truth that their family began with an act of compassion on a scorching summer day, when a weary traveler found not just shelter, but a home for her heart. Papa found Mama when she needed him most, William would tell his own children someday. And that's how our family began, with kindness, with courage, and with love that grew stronger through every season. It was a story worth telling, a legacy worth preserving, and a love worth celebrating, the unexpected journey that began when a pregnant woman collapsed from exhaustion, and a cowboy took her in and gave her not just rest, but a lifetime of happiness.